Welcome back, everybody. Before we get into this, understand something up front. What you're about to hear is not a rumor pieced together from anonymous forum posts. This is happening right now, tracked by open source military analysts, confirmed through satellite imagery, and acknowledged in pieces by officials on both sides. And what it points to is simple. The pause in the Iran war is not the end of the war. It might just be the deep breath before the biggest round yet. Here's what happened. After nearly 2 weeks of consecutive nightly strikes against Iran, the United States called a halt. Iran, for its part, claimed it did the same. On paper, that sounds like the beginning of an off-ramp. In practice, satellite trackers and defense reporters watching the region say something very different is unfolding underneath that quiet. The naval blockade of Iranian ports that Washington reimposed earlier this month has stayed fully in place. Carrier strike groups haven't gone home. And within days of the pause taking hold, the fighting resumed anyway, with a fresh wave of American strikes hitting targets in Iran over the weekend, including locations reported near Abadan and in Bushehr province. So whatever this pause actually is, it is not disarmament, it's repositioning. Let's start with what's sitting on the water, because that's where the real signal is. Right now, the U.S. has multiple carrier strike groups either on station or cycling through the Central Command area of responsibility, with the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush both tracked operating in the Gulf of Oman, at times within a couple hundred kilometers of the Iranian coastline. Alongside them, the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group, built around the USS Boxer and its accompanying warships, finally completed its own long, strange journey into theater after a deployment that started back in March. That's not a footnote. That ship spent months crossing the Pacific, drifting through the South China Sea, and re-aggregating with its group before it ever set foot, so to speak, in the actual fight it was sent for. Naval power looks instant on a headline. It is never instant in real life. But here's the problem with just counting hulls. Ships alone don't tell you intent. What tells you intent is what's flying above them and what's been quietly drawn down. And that's where this story gets more interesting than a simple "more troops incoming" headline. Open source trackers monitoring Royal Air Force Fairford in England reported that the last of the B-52 bomber detachments that had been flying out of there for weeks recently departed. On the surface, that sounds like de-escalation, fewer heavy bombers forward deployed. But defense analysts watching this closely aren't reading it that way. They're reading it as a shift, not a stand-down. Strategic air power doesn't just vanish from a war zone. It rotates, repositions, and reloads. And when you match a bomber drawdown against a naval buildup that's holding steady or growing, what you're actually looking at is a force posture in transition, not a force posture standing still. Now let's rewind slightly, because to understand why this pause is so fragile, you need to understand exactly how we got here. This latest chapter didn't start in isolation. It followed weeks of an already brutal campaign. U.S. Central Command carried out a sustained nightly bombing campaign against Iran that, by some counts from military officials, struck more than 15,000 targets over roughly 2 weeks. 15,000. That number alone should tell you the scale of what's already happened before we even get to what might come next. Iran did not absorb that quietly. Tehran responded with its own retaliatory wave, launching ballistic missiles and drones toward American positions and toward Israel, hitting or attempting to hit U.S. bases across Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, while reportedly also targeting an American aircraft carrier operating in the region. That's an extraordinarily aggressive move, targeting a U.S. carrier directly, and it tells you Iran is not simply playing defense here. It's testing exactly how far it can push before Washington's response escalates past the point either side can walk back from. And escalate it did. Reports indicate American troops were killed and wounded during that exchange, and U.S. and Israeli forces answered with intensified strikes, hitting targets in the Iranian capital itself, and reportedly killing senior regime figures in the process. Iranian state and Red Crescent sources put the civilian toll in the hundreds, though as always with numbers coming out of Tehran, there's an obvious incentive to shape that narrative for global sympathy. So those figures deserve real scrutiny rather than blind acceptance. What isn't in dispute is that this became, within a matter of days, one of the most violent stretches of direct state-on-state conflict the region has seen in years. Here's where things changed again. Even after that brutal exchange, there was a brief window where talks looked possible. Interim Iranian leadership reportedly reached out, and the American president said he was willing to engage. But that window didn't hold. Within weeks, fighting resumed, driven in large part by Iran's continued pressure campaign against shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and by a reinstated American naval blockade on Iranian ports designed to choke off exactly the kind of revenue and resupply Tehran needs to keep this fight going. Each time a pause has looked like it might stick this year, something has pulled it back apart. That's not speculation. That's simply the documented pattern of how this conflict has behaved for months. Now here's the part that should genuinely concern anyone watching global markets, not just people following troop movements for their own sake. Failed talks over the Strait of Hormuz have already sent oil prices sharply higher, with crude benchmarks climbing hard on nothing more than the news that negotiations broke down. Every time this war flares, insurance costs for tankers spike, shipping companies reroute around the entire Arabian Peninsula, and energy markets swing on single headlines out of Tehran or Washington. This is not a contained regional dispute anymore. It's sitting directly on top of one of the most sensitive choke points in the global economy, and every fresh round of this fighting sends a shockwave through it. There's also a quieter, more unsettling thread running underneath all of this, and it's worth pulling on. There have been reports, treated with appropriate caution, that outside powers may be helping Iran sustain its capability despite the losses it's taken. Specifically, there have been claims that China has been moving rocket launchers toward Iran through Pakistan, reportedly numbering in the hundreds. The American president was asked directly about those reports and said he would be, in his words, surprised if that turned out to be true, which is about as close as an official comment gets to neither confirming nor fully dismissing something. Whether that support is state-directed or something murkier isn't clear yet. But the logic behind it isn't complicated at all. Keeping the United States tied down in a prolonged Middle Eastern air campaign serves the strategic interests of more than one rival power. Because every dollar and every flight hour spent over Iran is a dollar and a flight hour that isn't available somewhere else in the world. That's not the end of it, though, because this conflict has never respected Iran's borders. Iran's regional allies have their own role to play here. Iranian-aligned militia groups in Iraq have already threatened retaliation after joint American and Saudi strikes hit their positions, warning that Washington and Riyadh would, in their words, pay a heavy price for operating on Iraqi soil. Meanwhile, Iranian-backed Houthi forces have separately declared that Saudi-flagged vessels attempting to reach the Indian Ocean would become targets, which raises the very real possibility of a second maritime choke point effectively closing at the same moment the Strait of Hormuz remains under pressure. If that happens, this stops being a two-country dispute and becomes a genuine global shipping crisis, because a staggering share of the world's oil and gas moves through exactly those waters. Let's talk about the platforms actually doing the work here, because that's where the real capability story lives. Carrier air wings operating off the Abraham Lincoln and the George H.W. Bush have been flying strike and reconnaissance sorties around the clock, with fighter squadrons cycling through night operations to keep pressure on Iranian air defense and coastal targets. Long-range bomber support has rotated through forward bases, positioned specifically to put deeply buried, hardened targets within reach without excessive refueling. And running underneath every single one of those platforms is the unglamorous machinery that actually makes any of it possible. Tankers, cargo aircraft, a nonstop logistics bridge feeding fuel, munitions, and personnel into theater. None of that shows up in a dramatic headline. All of it is the actual engine behind everything that does. So where does this actually leave us? Iran's strategic bet from the start of this conflict has been that it can outlast American political will, absorb the damage, let global sympathy build, and hope the political cost of an open-ended air campaign eventually outweighs Washington's appetite to continue. That's historically not been an irrational bet for a regime like this to make. Democracies typically do have shorter patience for prolonged conflict than governments that don't answer to voters. But that calculation gets a lot harder to sustain when your own side keeps providing the justification for the other side's next move, whether that's continued interference with commercial shipping or attempted strikes against a U.S. carrier group. It's difficult to frame yourself as the victim when your own actions keep restarting the clock. And that's really the tension defining this entire moment. Every piece needed for the largest strike package of this war so far is already in place or actively moving into position. Multiple carrier strike groups, an amphibious ready group finally on station after a months-long transit. Thousands of additional troops reportedly flowing toward the region. Tightened operational security around American personnel in Jordan, a naval blockade that never actually stood down even while the bombing paused. None of that is proof that the next strike is guaranteed, but history from this exact conflict, going back through multiple broken ceasefires and expired deadlines this year alone, does not exactly inspire confidence that this pause is any different from the ones that came before it. So here's the honest, unglamorous truth sitting underneath every dramatic headline about carriers and troop numbers. Wars like this don't usually end with a single dramatic knockout blow. They end, or they don't end, based on whether the diplomacy happening quietly in places like Oman and through third-party mediators can actually outpace the next provocation on the water. Right now, both tracks are running at the same time. The talking and the buildup. Nobody involved, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not among the analysts tracking every ship movement in real time, actually knows yet which one wins the race. What do you think happens from here? Does this pause hold long enough for something real to take shape? Or is this simply Iran and the United States both reloading for a bigger round than anything we've seen so far? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to keep tracking exactly how this develops, stick around, because between the ship movements, the diplomacy, and the sheer scale of hardware already sitting in that region, this story is very clearly not finished yet. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.